Tonight, my son, Mason Hale, CEO of Northbridge Security, sent 4 words: "Mom, don't show up." I turned the car toward Rockport, and 27 missed calls exploded on my screen. Inside the ballroom, the Aegis Vault demo rolled, then hospital data flashed across the giant LED. Screams, shattering glass, investors walking out, Mason vanished. I pulled onto the shoulder, flipped open my laptop. A strange code branch, speed traded for security, bypassed review. If I don't slam the system shut now, by dawn, Northbridge will be bleeding data nonstop. I drop a gear and head back to Boston. They cut me out for image. But when the wall collapses, I'm the only one who knows the password to the foundation. And I will save this company before I have to drag my own son from the rubble. Tonight, my son, Mason Hale, CEO of Northbridge Security, sent 4 words that hit harder than any boardroom blow. "Mom, don't show up." The message popped on my screen while his face was still lit by the soft, flattering glow of the Harbor Light Hotel's ballroom lights. He'd called to align expectations, as if I were a vendor he needed to manage, not the woman who mortgaged her future to fund his. I closed the laptop before the apology that wouldn't come, set my keys on the counter, and stood very still in my quiet apartment until the silence felt like a verdict. Then I picked up the keys and started driving north toward Rockport, telling myself the ocean air would be better than choking down one more humiliation among crystal stemware and curated smiles. The highway unspooled in front of me, black and clean and empty. I let the car settle into its hum, watched Boston's lights fall away in the rear view, and told myself I was done. Done trying to fit the silhouette Mason's new world demanded. Sleeker, quieter, less me. Somewhere after the I-95 split, my phone began to vibrate against the console in a rhythm that didn't match any spam call I'd ever ignored. It wouldn't stop. 27 missed calls stacked into a pillar of urgency. Texts bloomed beneath them, names I knew as well as my own: Gabe Hart, Priya Desai, Daniel Park. Even an unknown number with a Wall Street Journal tag, Rachel Stein. The last message from Priya filled the screen and all the air in the car with it. Emergency. Aegis Vault demo exposed real client data. System integrity failing. Investors walking out. Mason unreachable. We need you. Now. I pulled onto the shoulder so fast the gravel spit against the undercarriage. The road around me was dark, a halo of fog rolling in from the marshes. I didn't feel the cold through the half-open window. I felt something else. The hard, cool click of a part of my brain I had tried very hard to retire. I reached into the passenger seat for the old laptop I never stopped keeping charged, opened it on the center console, and tethered to my phone. 2-factor prompts slid into muscle memory. The Artemis backdoor I'd built in the company's first year, quiet, deniable, ethical only in the sense that I never abused it, lit up like an old friend. Northbridge's system health panel was a field hospital at triage. Alerts stacked in bleeding red, external interfaces thrashing, audit queues ballooning, authentication tokens reissuing under stress. But the log diff told the story faster than any dashboard. 93 days ago, a replacement of the core encryption handshake, my stubborn, carefully audited, battle-tested architecture, swapped for something leaner. Faster throughput, lower latency, and a dozen tiny compromises that, individually, looked like rounding errors and together, looked like a house with no foundation. The author name on the commit was familiar in a way that made my jaw tighten: Julian Ashford. A Harvard luminary with immaculate slide decks and a friend of a friend pedigree to Victoria Whitmore, the woman who had decided my son was an unfinished product she could sand smooth. I scrolled through the code, line by line, the way you touch a bruise to know where it begins and ends. There it was, a concession to UI responsiveness that deferred validation to post-render. A token reuse assumption for throughput in high-visibility demos. A bypass flag for the review pipeline that shouldn't have existed and somehow did. None of this would have gotten past Northbridge's security review, when Northbridge was still the company Mason and I built in a drafty brick loft with borrowed chairs and a whiteboard that wobbled. But Northbridge now had ballrooms and PR agencies and lists of who belonged and who did not. And tonight, in front of every person Mason had been trying so hard to impress, Aegis Vault had pulled patient data from Boston Memorial and painted it 10 feet tall on an LED wall. I called Gabe first because he never wasted time pretending problems were anything other than problems. He answered on the first ring, voice clipped and steady the way men's voices get when chaos knocks. "Tell me you're already in, Nora." "I'm in," I said. The vulnerability was introduced 3 months ago when Julian's team replaced the handshake. They bypassed the mandatory review path. We need a full shutdown of all external interfaces. 12 hours minimum, no half fixes. "Do it," Gabe said. "No hesitation, no theater." The board meets in 30. Priya and Daniel are trying to hold the portal together for client optics. "Tell them to stop doing that," I said, already writing the emergency patch doc, already pulling the rollback scripts I'd tucked into an archive, because I knew someday someone would talk my son into moving fast on the wrong thing. We cannot operate a compromised system. Every minute live is liability. Bring the charter to the meeting. Section 7.3, you'll need it. He exhaled, a sound that carried both relief and grim acknowledgement. "You always did hide the parachute in the wall. Get back here, Nora." "I'm on my way," I said, and closed the laptop. The drive back down felt shorter, the road narrower, my hands steadier than they had any right to be. I didn't think about the moment, hours earlier when Mason had practiced his careful, polished "we" while meaning "you" and "me" in different sentences. I didn't think about the blue dress in my closet, the one I'd planned to wear because it didn't apologize for my age or pretend I was someone else's mother. I thought about optionality, how you teach your kid to build it into code and business and life, and how, tonight, the only optionality left was the kind you take whether you're invited to or not. Northbridge's glass tower threw a cold reflection of the city back at itself. Reporters hovered like gulls in the lobby, security guards forming imperfect lines to keep them from breaking up the school of panicked employees sweeping past. I made eye contact with no one and everyone. People who had been hired long after I was transitioned from day-to-day operations still stopped talking when I stepped off the elevator. If respect and terror have cousins, their family reunion was happening on the 24th floor. Priya met me with an embrace that tried and failed to disguise itself as professional. "Thank God," she said. Her makeup had held even as her composure had not. "Boston Memorial's counsel is in the war room. Ruth and Paul are already asking governance questions. And," she glanced down the corridor toward the conference rooms, "Tori's father is being himself." I could have said a lot of things in that moment. I could have asked where Mason was. I could have asked what exactly Edward Whitmore had decided he was entitled to do inside a company that wasn't his. I could have envied the men who never had to calculate whether their competence made them threatening. Instead, I said, "We're going dark. Now." Priya's nod held the relief of someone who had been holding her breath for an hour too long. "Daniel can execute. He's waiting for your word." I stepped into the Security Operations Center and felt the room's temperature shift, the way rooms do when a parent walks in, and the kids who thought they were grown remember they're not. Daniel stood from the command console and made space without a speech. "We've isolated the client portal, but core services are still emitting attack surface," I finished, fingers already moving. "We're shutting down all external interfaces. Cue up the rollback to Aegis Handshake 4.1. I want 3 independent verifications before any component comes back up. New rule, no security-related code ships without triple review. Product, ops, and external audit. The board will ratify it before breakfast. Until then, I am the rule." A young woman near the client comm station, Lila Brooks, I remembered, even though we'd never been introduced, stepped forward with that particular tone people use when they're about to tell you business realities trump physics. "With respect, a full shutdown puts us in SLA breach with 6 enterprise clients, and—" "We are already in breach," I said, looking at her until she stopped looking at her dashboard and looked at me. "Of something that matters more than an SLA. Trust. If we don't fix the foundation, we won't have clients to breach with." She swallowed and nodded. It wasn't surrender so much as recognition. The lights in the SE always ran cool. A low blue meant to soothe the nervous system during crises that didn't care about circadian rhythms. Keyboards clicked into a collective rhythm that, once upon a time, had been my favorite music. I wrote the emergency memo that would become our legal posture. Sent a draft to Priya with bullet points that sounded like we hadn't been running on adrenaline and coffee for 2 hours. Immediate containment. Transparent disclosure. Independent third-party verification. I attached the log diffs, annotated the commit trail with dates, names, the bypass flag that would keep a compliance officer up at night. I didn't write Julian Ashford in the subject line. I didn't need to. Everyone who needed to know, knew. From the hallway, a voice rose and sharpened, a tone cultivated at golf clubs and legacy boards. This is what happens when you let founders cling to old code because it flatters their ego. Edward Whitmore, in full broadcast mode. I didn't alter my breathing. Men like Edward thrived on oxygen you could choose not to give them. Boardroom in 5, Gabe said from the doorway, his expression telling me he'd heard the same voice and chosen the same response. They're about to require Section 7.3 to do what needs to be done. I brought it, I said, tapping the laptop. And a plan. Of course you did, he said, and for a heartbeat, the corner of his mouth tipped in something that might one day be called a smile. We walked the corridor together past the glass fishbowl of Conference C, where I saw Mason crumpled in a chair I'd watched him grow into. His suit, custom, exquisite, had folded wrong at the waist the way fabric does when the person inside it isn't holding himself up. Victoria stood beside him, posture immaculate, anger precise in the way of people who think rage is best served cold. Edward's profile was a Roman coin, stern and unearned, as he spoke with the authority of wealth that had gotten used to being treated as wisdom. Through the soundproofed glass, I watched my son try to be 3 versions of himself at once. The leader in front of his team, the future son-in-law before a man who wouldn't forgive weakness, and the boy who had built his first computer on our kitchen table with parts we bought in cash from a warehouse south of the city. He didn't see me. It's possible he couldn't. In the boardroom, Ruth Kaplan's pen tapped once against her legal pad and then stopped as I plugged into the screen. Paul Dyson folded his hands. 2 seats at the head of the table sat empty, a gesture of neutrality that fooled no one. Let's begin, Gabe said. Miss Hale has the floor. I didn't clear my throat. I didn't apologize for the length of what I was about to show them. I put the log diffs on the screen, highlighted the handshake change, and spoke in a voice that had learned a long time ago that men who argued with it were arguing with facts, not me. 93 days ago, Northbridge replaced its core encryption handshake with an unvetted, performance-optimized variation that deferred validation to post-render in high-throughput scenarios. The change bypassed the mandatory security review. Tonight, under demo load, the deferred validation allowed a stale token to reference a live dataset, Boston Memorial's staging mirror, resulting in exposure of real patient data on a public display. This is not a freak interaction. It is a predictable failure mode when governance is treated as optional. I click through to the plan. We are shutting down all external interfaces for 12 hours to rebuild the security layer on the last verified architecture. During that window, we will 1. Patch and restore the handshake. 2. Institute a triple review protocol for any security-adjacent code. 3. Prepare disclosures for all affected clients with a timeline, remediation steps, and third-party audit commitments. We will lead our narrative with transparency and competence, not spin. If we do this right, we can contain legal exposure, retain key clients, and begin repairing trust. If we do anything less, we risk cascading breaches, regulator action, and a reputational crater we won't climb out of. Authority, Ruth said, eyes on the charter. Who signs off if the CEO disagrees? Section 7.3, I said. Emergency powers to the board to enact leadership measures necessary to stabilize the company in a crisis that threatens ongoing viability. Gabe slid copies down the table. The paper made a soft sound that carried the weight of a gavel. We need a name for interim CSO, Paul said, voice even. Ruth looked at me, not unkindly. You prepared for that answer when you parked on the shoulder, didn't you? I prepared for it months ago when I failed to teach my son that process is not the enemy of speed, I said. I didn't let the line land with bitterness, just accuracy. I'll take the role. 12 weeks. Enough to rebuild the scaffolding so no one can push changes like this again without tripping 3 alarms. Gabe nodded. All in favor? Hands rose around the table like a tide. I didn't look through the glass to see if Mason had finally looked up. I didn't need the permission of the son who had asked me to stay away from the party. I had a company to save. A team that still trusted the sound of my voice, and a city that knew what happened to buildings erected without respect for load-bearing walls. I closed the deck, unplugged the cable, and walked back toward the cool blue light of the SUS, where Daniel would already be staging the shutdown banner, and Priya would be drafting the language clients would read in the morning. Out in the lobby, the cameras would be waiting. Inside the elevator, my reflection held my gaze and didn't look away. Tonight they cut me out for image. Before dawn, I would give them a different one to remember. A foundation that does not fall. Daniel didn't wait for ceremony. By the time I stepped back into the SOC, the shutdown banner was already staged in a sandbox, timed messaging drafted, rollback scripts queued on a separate, scrubbed instance. The room had that compressed sound you only hear in hospitals at 2 a.m. and server rooms during incident response. Breath held, chairs barely creaking, keyboards ticking like metronomes. I slid into the command seat and felt the old familiarity settle into my spine like a remembered posture. Execute, I said. On the wall of screens, external interfaces winked out in a planned cascade. Client portal, partner API, demo environments, public endpoints. An eerie calm followed, as if we had pulled a city's power and the skyline had for a beat remembered stars. Daniel counted down the core service freeze. Priya's message to clients went live at the exact second the last interface turned gray. We are taking Northbridge dark to protect you. We will return when it is safe. Here is exactly what we're doing and why. It was the opposite of spin. It was the tone you take when you tell someone a hard truth you intend to fix. I opened the diff tool, summoned the archived handshake, and started stitching the system back to the last architecture I trusted with my name. Nothing about it was glamorous. It was screws and joists and stress tests, a return to the idea that security is not a product feature, but a building code. We built a fenced lane for the rollback to travel through and dared nothing to jump it. 3 verification teams spun up in parallel like fire lines. Product engineers to integrate, operations to harden, external auditors on a secure bridge to bless or flag. Daniel managed the choreography, translating my guardrails into air traffic control. Somewhere outside the SOC, the company continued to bleed reputationally while we cauterized technically. Priya texted updates from the war room, her sentences stripped of adjectives by fatigue and the necessity of precision. Boston Memorial's counsel had switched from threat display to negotiation once they saw our transparency in the plan. Ruth and Paul were holding the board in a line. No panic decisions, no vanity statements until we could walk back in with green lights. Gabe kept the lobby cameras fed with exactly nothing, which seemed to anger them into staying. And that was fine. Let them get tired. At 1:12 a.m. we hit the first verification milestone. The restored handshake passed integrity checks across staging mirrors. I leaned back just far enough to feel the chair resist me, and not far enough to let anyone think I was done. Phase 2, I said. Token lifecycle tests. Stress at 3 times demo load. Simulate concurrent auth refresh under lossy conditions. A younger engineer to my left, tired, determined, hands shaking only a little, said, "Yes, ma'am," and I flinched at a word I never chose and was now too exhausted to correct. He ran the harness. The graphs rose, shivered, and leveled. A jitter I didn't like rippled through one metric and then disappeared. I followed it back to a cache layer tuned by someone who liked wins and sprint retrospectives more than they liked sleeping through crises. I marked it. We would fix that after dawn. Coffee? Daniel asked without looking away from his console. Strong, I said. He returned with 2 mugs like a ritual he had wanted to perform for years and finally could. I took a sip and felt my senses sharpen to the exact edge where competence lives and anxiety dies. Status on the triple review protocol? I asked. Drafted, he said. I templated it into the pipeline. No ticket closes without 3 signatures, product, ops, and a rotating external security sign-off. No bypass flags exist anywhere I can find. If someone invents one, it will be a firing offense. Make it a firing offense and a board notification, I said. I never want to sit in another room where people pretend they didn't know the risk because the org chart let them not know. Copy, he said, and meant it. At 2:03 a.m., the hallway outside the sea rippled with raised voices, the brittle timbre of people whose power has been questioned and who answer with volume. I didn't turn. If I've learned anything about men like Edward Whitmore, it's that standing makes them taller only to themselves. A second later, Gabe stepped through the door and closed it with a deliberate softness that turned the hallway back into weather we didn't have to acknowledge. He's leaving, Gabe said, quiet enough that only I could hear him. Tori too. I kept my eyes on the code. He'll be back when the cameras need a different kind of story, I said. I don't think so, Gabe said. Not soon. The story changed. On the far side of the glass, a figure moved past the wall of LEDs, alone, shoulders pitched forward. For a second, Mason's profile cut against a screen that read System Safe Mode, and he looked so much like himself at 15. Up past midnight with a problem set he refused to surrender to, that I had to anchor myself to the present by reading a log line aloud. Token rotation successful, I said, and the room exhaled as if I'd blessed them. At 3:17 a.m., Priya arrived with a sweater thrown over the evening dress that had seen too many bad hours. She handed me a mug and a printed sheet. Draft disclosure, she said. Plain language, timelines, remediation, audit engagements. I added a line I know legal will try to cut. I want us to keep it. I scanned the paragraph sheet underlined. We chose to take Northbridge offline because protecting your data matters more than protecting our optics. I looked up at her. We're keeping it, I said. If legal wants it out, they can fire me at 10. She smiled for the first time since the ballroom. Let them try. We pressed on. The room found a rhythm at that hour that people who don't do this kind of work will never understand. It's not heroics, it's practice. It's MapReduce for human beings. Break the impossible into small, verifiable pieces and move them in formation. I saw Lila at the client comms console, posture and tone changed, delivering facts to angry executives who wanted guarantees we couldn't give and would have been wrong to promise. She didn't deflect. She didn't hide. She told them what we were doing, why we were doing it, and when they would hear from us again. Somewhere between her first call and her fifth, she crossed from Mason loyalist to Northbridge defender, and I filed it away without ceremony. People show you who they are at 3 a.m. At 4:41 a.m., we hit the second milestone. The restored handshake past red team scenarios the auditors hadn't warned us about. At 5:08, we caught an edge case that could have bitten us in exactly one kind of failure that only happens during product demos with bad Wi-Fi and overconfident presenters. We fixed it. At 5:52, we restarted internal interfaces under a microscope and watched green lights steady across the boards like dawn along a coastline. Admin portal? Daniel asked. Bring it up, I said. Controlled access, no external calls. Priya, cue the note. Phase 1 complete. Phase 2, governance locks underway. She nodded, thumbs moving on her phone with an economy that came from years of telling hard truths to people who only wanted easy ones. Boston Memorial wants a morning brief with their CSO, she said. I told them 10. We'll need 2 of the auditors on that call. They'll be there, I said. Invite Gabe and Ruth. Keep it technical and transparent. No one sells, we earn. At 6:30, I stood for the first time in hours and felt the room stretch with me. Priya handed me a granola bar like a sacrament. Eat, she said. I need you vertical in 90 minutes for the board follow-up. I took a bite I didn't taste. Where is he? I asked before I could decide not to. In his office, she said. Door closed, lights on. He hasn't left since the board vote. The image assembled itself uninvited. Mason in that glass box he chose, because it looked like power. Alone in a suit cut to impress people who had left when their investment shifted from status to risk. I thought of him at 12, watching the paramedics wheel his father down a hallway with too much light. I thought of him at 19 at our kitchen table, the 2 of us bent over a spilled-out motherboard like surgeons. I thought of him at 35, telling me not to show up because the people he wanted to belong to didn't know how to read a woman like me without subtracting points. Patch window? I asked Daniel. 30 minutes to final verification, he said. Then we can start phased client reactivation. We're on time. Good, I said, and carried my coffee into the hallway. The building felt like a school at dawn the morning after a fire alarm. Empty, echoes in places you forget make sound. I walked past Conference C without looking. I stopped outside the CEO suite and lifted my hand to knock, then let it fall. I don't know why. Maybe because I didn't trust my voice not to say something mother-soft at a moment that required steel. Maybe because leadership is sometimes measured by what you don't force. Back in the SOC, the final checks had lined up in a neat column of green that made Daniel's shoulders drop a centimeter. I put both palms on the console and waited for my breath to find me. "Bring up administrative interfaces fully," I said. "Then we light the client portal in waves. No more than 10% of traffic for the first 15 minutes. Priya, your comm sequence goes with each wave. Short, declarative, no adjectives. Daniel, alarms at the ready. Anything flickers, we drop back to dark. We do not compromise the second time." They nodded. They were past words now and into the part of execution where you trust each other with your hands. We turned the system back on. It stayed on. Logs wrote the music we needed them to write. A trickle of client requests became a stream that became a river that did not flood. At 7:30, I let myself lean against the edge of the console and for the first time feel tired. Gabe appeared again, a suit in search of a bed, and leaned in the doorway in a way that made the frame look like it had been built for him. "How'd we do?" "We're back," I said. "No exposure, no regressions, guardrails in place. The auditors have enough to sign their names to. We'll spend a month patching every corner this touched and a quarter earning back what we lost in a night, but we're on the right side of possible." He nodded, eyes taking in the room, the people, the glow. "Board at 9, he said. "They'll want to hear it from you." "They will," I said. He hesitated a fraction longer than he'd planned. "He'll be there." "I know," I said. The team began to disperse in shifts, some to showers, some to couches, some to the kind of breakfast that tastes like survival. I stayed another 10 minutes, watching the monitors the way you watch a child sleep after a fever breaks. Then I walked to the small office with my name still on the door. Opened the closet where I'd left a black dress and flats and a garment bag like an insurance policy, and made myself presentable on a sink that had no business being a mirror. When I stepped back into the hall, he was there. Mason looked like a man who had stayed awake to hold something together and failed. His eyes were raw at the edges, his tie crooked by degrees, the perfect part in his hair collapsed into something human. For a beat, neither of us spoke. The building hummed around us, indifferent and alive. "The system is secure," I said, because that was the part of our relationship that had the fewest landmines. "We're bringing clients back in phases. Governance locks are in place." He swallowed. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse in the way of burned throat nights. "Priya told me, the board's impressed." I nodded. "They should be impressed with the team. They performed." He stared past me at a point on the wall that wasn't there. "I should have been in the room," he said. "You should have?" I said. "I didn't make it a knife. I made it a fact." His jaw worked once and then stilled. "I told you not to come," he said, softer now, as if we were already alone on the other side of something, and he was testing whether the ground would hold. "And you came anyway." "You built your first machine on my kitchen table," I said. "Did you think I was going to watch a wall of patient data roll behind you on a hotel screen and stay in Rockport because a girl with a last name told me I wasn't photogenic?" He huffed a breath that might one day be a laugh. Then he nodded, just once, a concession to gravity. "The board at 9, he said. "They're going to ask you to stay on permanently." "We'll talk about it after the call with Boston Memorial," I said. "And after you sleep. Nothing permanent gets decided when the sun's this new." He opened his mouth, closed it, and then did something he hadn't done since he was a boy and lost a baseball game he thought made or broke him. He put a hand on the doorframe to steady himself. "Thank you," he said, not looking at me, "for saving my company." "It isn't your company," I said, and he flinched until I finished. "It's ours. Or it's no one's. Go splash water on your face. Tell Priya you'll sit beside me in the briefings. That's where you start." He nodded and walked away like a man learning to carry weight the right way. I watched him go until the hallway turned him into a reflection in glass, and the reflection into light. Then I went back to the room where we had kept the thing he and I built from burning down. At 8:55, I took my seat in the boardroom, set my laptop on the table, and met the eyes of the people who had put out a different kind of fire for us before dawn. "Let's begin," Ruth said. "We already have," I said, and started talking. I took the same seat I'd used at midnight, but the room felt different in the daylight, less like a bunker, more like a court. Fluorescents hummed, coffee steamed in cardboard. The Harbor Light fiasco already had a nickname: the LED wall. Gabe sat to my right, still and ready. Ruth's legal pad waited in front of her like a quiet threat. Paul checked a message and set his phone face down with the finality of a gavel. One by one, heads turned toward the door as Mason walked in. He didn't try to reclaim the head of the table. He took the chair beside me, the same way he did at 19 when he'd present a half-finished architecture and wait to see where my pen would land. The board took him in the way a storm-weary town watches the next cloud, assessing, reserving judgment, remembering. Ruth began. Thank you all for reconvening. Miss Hale, your overnight report demonstrates full technical containment and a credible path to remediation. We'll want details, but first we need to align on governance. She glanced at Mason without a smile and then back to me. Last night exposed a structural failure. Changes bypassed mandated review. The board is not interested in scapegoats. We are interested in locks that can't be picked. I kept my voice at room temperature. Triplicate sign-off is in the pipeline now. Product, ops, external security. Bypass flags have been removed. Any attempt to introduce one pings the audit bus, notifies the board chair, and triggers a freeze until reviewed in camera. We're also instituting a quarterly external red team with public summaries. Clients will see the schedule and the results. Paul leaned in. Timelines? Locks are live, I said. Red team contract by week's end. First exercise within 30 days. I could feel Mason listening harder than the board. He used to do that, memorize the cadence, not the words, so he could rehearse later alone. Good, Ruth said, pen ticking once. Now leadership. The word changed the oxygen in the room. Mason's shoulder tightened. Gabe didn't move at all. Ruth continued. Emergency powers under 7.3 put Miss Hale in as interim CSO. We need to decide what interim means. Stability for clients and regulators requires clarity. I spoke before the silence could harden into something else. 3 months, I said. Hard stop. My mandate is to enshrine the locks, complete remediation, rebuild the incident program, and exit the role to a permanent leader we all agree on. During that time, Mason remains CEO. Publicly, we present aligned faces, not competing narratives. Paul arched an eyebrow. After 3 months? That depends on performance, ours with clients and his with governance. I didn't look at Mason when I said it, because the point wasn't to punish. I don't want to run Northbridge. I want Northbridge to be impossible to run badly. Ruth's pen stopped. Miss Hale, if the board asked you to stay past 3 months? I'd say we're solving the wrong problem, I answered. If a company's survival requires a specific person in a specific chair, it isn't governed, it's balanced on a stool. Gabe's mouth tipped, there and gone. Ruth took a beat and then nodded. Motion to appoint Miss Hale interim CSO for a period of 90 days with specific deliverables, governance locks, external red team engagement, client remediation complete, and a permanent CSO hiring plan with finalists. Weekly status to the board. CEO remains in role. All in favor? Gabe asked. Hands rose. Even the ones that had trembled last night were steady now. Ruth turned to Mason. Mr. Hale, you'll need to address external messaging. Investors, clients, media, no spin. No blame, no girlfriend's father. I'm aware, he said. The rasp had left his voice. He'd found the pitch he uses when he means it. Priya and I will lead investor comms. Nora will lead technical briefings. We'll sign statements together. And internal? Paul asked. He glanced at me, an old reflex, and then chose to stand on his own legs. All hands at noon, no adjectives. We tell them exactly what we did and why, and where we failed. The last word wasn't theatrical. It landed like a nail does when it sits flush with the wood. Ruth capped her pen. Good. Now the morning calls. Boston Memorial at 10. The financials at 11. Legal at 11:30. Miss Hale, your presence is required for the first 2. Mr. Hale, you'll join both. We moved through the agenda fast. Memos were approved, language tightened. The line Priya had written. We chose to take Northbridge offline because protecting your data matters more than protecting our optics. Survived unscathed. When we adjourned, the room exhaled like a unit coming off a wall. In the hallway, the building had shifted from aftermath to before work. Footsteps, the smell of pastry sugar and burnt espresso, the way people lower their voices as if loudness could call cameras back. Mason fell into step beside me, hands in his pockets like a teenager. "Thank you," he said without a flourish, "for drawing a circle I could stand in that wasn't a spotlight." "Stop thanking me, and stand in it," I said. "We've got 10 minutes. Priya had already set up the 10 o'clock on a secure bridge. Boston Memorial brought their CISO, counsel, and a cardiologist who kept pinching the bridge of his nose like he wanted to be anywhere else. We turned on cameras because hiding would have cost more than it saved. I delivered the summary with diagrams and dates. Priya shared the timeline. Daniel joined for implementation details. The auditor on our line, gray-haired, unblinking, careful, confirmed containment. When their counsel warmed up for a sermon, Mason did the one useful thing you can do in a room like that. He made an offer before they asked for it. "All costs of third-party audit and penetration testing for your systems integrating with Aegis Vault will be covered by Northbridge," he said. "All affected teams will have direct access to our security staff until you don't need them, and I will personally be available to your C-suite for the next 30 days. He didn't overpromise. He didn't sell. He put the check on the table. The cardiologist stopped pinching his nose. The CISO nodded once. Counsel pursed her lips, which is lawyer for "we still might sue you, but not today." We ended on the only acceptable note: scheduled next steps, documented responsibilities, a path you could walk with your eyes open. At 11, the financial clients were sharper, colder, trained by markets to hate uncertainty more than loss. Priya ran point. It was her canvas. I corrected 2 technical assumptions politely and left a third uncorrected because it didn't matter, and fighting it would have cost us goodwill. On the last call, I saw a face I hadn't expected. Rachel Stein from the Journal had joined as observer with their CFO's blessing. It was a tactic as old as money. Mason's eyes flicked to me. I blinked once. "We don't flinch," and he steadied. By noon, we'd survived the calls that decide whether a ship is still a ship. I walked with Mason toward the atrium where the all-hands would happen. Employees lined the mezzanines. The lobby plants had never looked so decorative. Daniel stood with a handful of his team near the front, Lila beside them, hair pulled back, posture soldier straight. Priya adjusted a mic and gave me a look that carried 3 entire sentences and a prayer. I nodded and took the side, not the middle, because this wasn't my coronation. Mason stepped up. He adjusted nothing. He didn't look for lights. He looked at people. "You already know what happened," he said. "You watched it in real time on a screen the size of our mistakes." A ripple moved through the atrium, somewhere between a grimace and a laugh. Truth does that. We failed our process. I approved a change that never should have bypassed review. We broke our own rules and paid for it on a stage. I can tell you about pressure and deadlines and the illusion of speed, but the only thing that matters is this: we were wrong. And we're fixing it. He gestured to me. I kept my words short. "We took us dark to protect you and our clients. The system's back. Locks are in. External audit starts this month. If you ship security-adjacent code, you will wait for 3 signatures or you will not ship. There isn't a second path. If you work with clients who want a date more than they want safety, you will tell them safety is the date." I let that sit. If anyone above you asks you to break the rules, you will bring it to me. You will not lose your job for doing that. It's possible you'll help someone else lose theirs. It wasn't elegant. It was the truth dressed for work. After, people didn't clap. Not because they weren't allowed to, but because clapping would have felt like absolution, and we weren't there yet. They nodded. They went back to their desks. In a crisis company, that's applause. By late afternoon, my stomach remembered I hadn't fed it. Priya pressed a protein bar into my palm. Daniel handed me water with the kind of gentleness you learn by sitting next to spinning fans at 4 a.m. Gabe wandered past my office door and paused. "You saved the patient," he said. "We stabilized the patient," I corrected. "Saving comes after discharge." He smiled without showing teeth. Semantics for the honest. When my inbox dipped below 100 for the first time all day, I checked the clock and realized it was nearly 6. The building had shifted into that post-day murmur, less sprint, more shuffle, the sound of people deciding whether to go home or take their laptops to dinner. A message slid onto my screen, the way important messages sometimes do. Unadorned, nakedly itself. Dinner? Bellini's. 7. If you don't hate me. M. The cheap part of me wanted to say no because it would have cost him more. The honest part said yes because it would have bought us both time we needed. I typed back 7, grabbed my coat, and felt the weight in my shoulders relocate from my muscles to my conscience, which is where it belongs. Bellini's smelled like tomatoes, garlic, and decisions made with butter. Marco caught my eye from across the dining room and did that thing only proprietors with ancient souls can do, wave you into belonging. He sat me at the corner table we used in the days when we were small enough to eat pasta and dream bigger than our bank balance. I smoothed the paper napkin with a thumb because sometimes hands need something simple to do. Mason arrived on time, which counts twice after the kind of day we'd had. He'd swapped his suit for a shirt with sleeves he could roll, which made him look like the man who used to take apart radios because silence bored him. He sat. We didn't talk for a while. Marco brought wine without asking and a plate of bread like a bribe. He lifted his glass. To not lying anymore? It wasn't a toast, it was a dare at himself. To telling the right truth at the right time, I said, and we touched rims softly. He set the glass down. They're gone, he said. He didn't have to say who. Tori left a note that blamed timing and optics and said she needed space to process. Her father texted Gabe and CC'd me on something that read like a press release. He stared at the table a second. I know what you want to say. I've said it to myself all day. I wasn't going to say it, I said. Pain teaches. Sometimes it overcharges. He nodded, grateful not to be flayed. I forgot what Northbridge was for. I forgot who I was for. That's a lot of forgetting, I said. I broke a piece of bread and dipped it in oil. You remembered last night. Remembering is muscle. You use it or you lose it. We ordered without reading the menu, because some things don't require research. When the plates arrived, the steam and the sauce made their own weather between us. The first forkful loosened something in my chest I hadn't realized was clenched. Quiet can be generous when it's earned. He set his fork down and looked at me like a man deciding to say the sentence that either frees him or ends him. If the board asks you to stay past 90 days, he said, say no. Not because I want control back. Because I want us to build something that doesn't need your name to stay upright. And because I want a version of us that isn't just Northbridge. I already told them no, I said. In the room. He blinked. The surprise was clean, bright. You did? I like my house in Rockport, I said. I like mornings that smell like salt and coffee and not recycled air. I like being something other than a safety net people remember only when they fall. I will do the 90. We will hire someone great. We will write our own obsolescence into their job description. And then you and I will decide what us looks like when we aren't holding a company under the waterline. He breathed out in a way that looked like relief and hurt at once. I want Sundays, he said. At the very least. You can have Sundays, I said. Whatever the board says. He laughed, and it didn't sound like a man patching himself together with jokes. It sounded like a boy on a porch with a summer ahead of him. Do you? He started and then regrouped. Dad would have hated tonight. Dad would have hated the LED wall, I agreed. He would have loved the part where you told a hospital the truth and didn't blink. He swallowed around something old. I thought about him at 5 this morning. I opened the bottom drawer and looked at his photo and didn't close it fast. I asked it a question. I lifted an eyebrow. And? The picture didn't answer, he said, but the part of me that doesn't talk did. Marco interrupted at exactly the right second with espresso and the kind of dessert you pretend you won't eat. Mason watched the crema settle and then said, when this is stable, after the audits, after the hire, after the stock stops being a cliff, let's build a satellite near Rockport. Not a palace. 2 rooms, a secure line, rules like your house, no work after 6, no calls on Sunday unless something actually burns. Balance, I said. That old myth. It doesn't have to be a myth, he said. It can be a boundary. He paid the check, without theatrics, and stood without trying to pull my chair out. He's learning where chivalry ends and performance begins. Outside, Charles Street was colder than it had any right to be. He shoved his hands in his pockets and glanced at me sideways the way he did when he was 7 and wanted permission without asking. Blueberry pancakes, I said before he could. Saturday, 10. If you bring that atrocious artisanal syrup again, I'm locking the door. He grinned, a real one. Copy. Back at the office the next morning, the world did what the world does after a spectacle. It changed the subject half a degree. Rachel Stein's piece in the Journal landed early, surgical, skeptical, fair. She quoted our line about optics and data without rolling her eyes in print, which is journalist for Weistpapints. I'll give you the chance to prove it. Clients booked follow-ups. The regulator requested documentation with a tone you can't hear in an email, but you can feel anyway. We sent it without filigree. Ruth forwarded a note from a general counsel I respected that read, "This is how you do it when you've done it wrong." I pinned it in my head, not on a wall. By midweek, applications for the permanent CSO role were stacked high enough to build a small fort. I read the first tranche at my kitchen table after dark, with the ocean as percussion, red penning any resume that treated zero trust as a brand instead of a discipline. I circled 3 names. One had war stories that read like a manual. One had the humility I'd measure a company by if I could. One had a gap year that included volunteering in a public defender's office because he'd watched a breach ruin a woman who didn't own a computer and decided he should understand damage where it actually lands. I wrote interview beside all 3 and set the red pen down. My phone buzzed. A photo from Mason lit the glass. A crooked shelf he'd hung himself. A little proud, a little sheepish. Guest room ready, the caption read, "Saturday. Pancakes. I'll bring edible syrup." I typed "bring nothing" and looked out at the winter water folding against itself. The incident had turned into a corridor we could walk instead of a pit we could fall into. The company had rules now that didn't care about anyone's last name. The son I raised had found his way back to a voice he didn't have to clean for cameras. We weren't done. We weren't safe. We were moving. On Friday afternoon, Priya slid into my doorway with a stack of drafts and a smirk she had earned. SEC opened a formal inquiry into Whitmore Capital, she said, like she was telling me the weather. Accounting practices. Multiple quarters. Rachel will have it by Monday. I didn't celebrate. I let the information settle into the bone where irony sometimes lives. Sometimes a door slams because the room is on fire, I said. She laughed softly. Put that on a poster. Put it in the playbook, I said, under why we don't trade foundation for speed. At 6, I shut my laptop. At 7, I stood on my porch in Rockport and tasted the air. At 8, I slept like a person who had told the right truth at the right time and only had to do it again tomorrow. And at 10 on Saturday, I flipped a pancake while a car rolled over, crushed shells on my driveway, and a man who used to be a boy walked into my kitchen without knocking, which is how a house is a home, and a company is just a building you take care of, so people can go back to the life that made it worth erecting in the first place. The week after the LED wall, Boston thawed the way cities do when they want a story to be something that happened instead of something that is. We didn't get that luxury. Every morning started with a call sheet and ended with a stack of signatures, and in between lived the part people don't make montages about. Patience, measured in minutes. Trust, measured in how many times you can explain the same thing without sounding tired of the truth. On Monday, we put on suits we didn't resent and stepped into a room 14 floors above Federal Street to face investors who had been gracious on paper and sharp in person. The conference room had a view that made small talk easy, sailboats like punctuation on a gray harbor, and a table that made anyone who sat at the end feel shorter. Mason didn't take the end. He took the middle, between me and Priya, and let the seating chart tell the first part of the story. This is not about one person selling you certainty. This is about 3 people owning a problem. Gabe opened with context like only men who've bought and sold empires can. Short, dry, undeniable. Then he nodded to me. I didn't bring slides with color. I brought a deck that looked like a lab report. We replaced the compromised handshake with the last audited version, instituted triple review that cannot be bypassed without telling on itself, and scheduled an independent red team that will publish a summary you can read without a dictionary. I clicked to a diagram and let the lines do their work. We took the company dark because safety beats optics. We came back online in waves, no secondary exposure. We are re-earning trust the way you should, slowly. A man in a suit the color of old money steepled his fingers. "And the cultural piece?" he asked. His tone was polite, his eyes were not. "Because failures like this are rarely just code." "Culture is changing," Mason said before I could. "Not defensive, not spun. We ship speed over safety. We don't do that now. Nora's locks make it hard to make the wrong decision and easy to see who tried." He didn't smile. "Starting with me." The man let out air he didn't know he was holding. Someone else went for the throat. "Why should we believe the co-leadership story isn't just optics?" I could feel a version of myself that used to snap at questions like that, stretch its knuckles. I let it rest, because it would have been easier to have me sit in his chair and call it rescue, I said. Easier for headlines, harder for the company. We're building a system that doesn't require my name to stand, and a CEO who doesn't need a spotlight to lead. Rachel Stein sat near the back with a notebook, and the look of someone who expected to be disappointed and preferred to be surprised. When the Q&A stalled, she asked the one that mattered. "What do you do the next time a beautiful demo wants to cut a corner?" "We pull the plug," I said. "On the demo, not the discipline." The meeting ended without a standing ovation, which is how you know it went well. They shook hands like adults, not converts, and asked for schedules, not reassurances. Back at Northbridge, the SOC screens glowed their calm blues, and no alarms sang. Quiet, after a week like ours, felt like music. By Wednesday, resume stopped being PDFs and be people on screens, then people in rooms. We interviewed for the role I was building myself out of with the same ruthlessness I would have wanted for me. One candidate told a story about a breach with a punchline that made his own team the butt of the joke. He didn't make it to round 2. One candidate drew a map of her incident program that included a box labeled empathy, then argued why it belonged in the runbook as much as containment. She stayed on the list. The last candidate, Omar, arrived without theater and left without promises. In between, he asked 2 questions that told me everything. What will this job break in me if I let it? And what will this job build in us if we let it? He wrote nothing down. I watched him memorize instead. That afternoon gave us the kind of test you never plan but always need. At 3:07 p.m., a minor service in an ancillary product began to misbehave, the kind of cascading timeout that used to turn into a Slack fire and a meeting request from a client who loved to say urgent in subject lines. A year ago, we would have argued about ownership. 6 months ago, we would have patched the symptom and prayed. A month ago, we would have asked whether the demo next week could afford a hiccup. At 3:10 p.m., Lila raised the flag in the incident channel without waiting for permission. At 3:12, Daniel froze the service behind a gate I had insisted on, and everyone had hated until now. At 3:14, the triple review path lit up yellow on a dashboard and called it what it was. Not an emergency, not a crisis, not a "we'll watch it." A stop sign. Someone typed "thank you" in the channel. No one typed "are we sure?" We didn't even bother the blue lights in the SASE. Sometimes proof of culture is a yawn. The regulator call came the next morning with the freeze of formal government patience. We had our documents lined up in a folder that sounded like penance, evidence, controls, audit, and we clicked into it like a choir. I walked the examiner through the locks. Priya handled the communications trail. The auditor backed us with the weight of someone who had charged us real money to say real things. When the examiner asked why the bypass flag had existed at all, I didn't throw a single person under a single bus. We optimized for impression over integrity, I said, Manila blunt. We don't anymore. After lunch, we found out Whitmore Capital had more than optics to worry about. The SEC inquiry wasn't rumor anymore. It had a number, a letterhead, and the kind of scope that makes PR agencies schedule standing calls on Sundays. Gabe forwarded the notice to me with "just thought you'd want the link." I read it and set my phone face down. Some messes clean themselves without you getting your hands dirty. Some doors close, so you don't have to pretend you aren't going to walk through them. Mason stopped in my doorway with 2 coffees, and the look he gets when he's already decided to say the expensive thing. "I want to talk about the announcement," he said. "Not the one that says Nora's interim. The one that says what we are after that." "Say it out loud," I said. "Co-leadership," he said. "Permanent. Me as CEO. You as CTO with security authority, clear lines, real veto power where it matters. Not because we need your name, he added, and it didn't feel like a hedge, but because the way we work together is the thing I was pretending I could replace with posture. I watched him for the flicker of the old hunger, approval dressed as ambition. It didn't show. If we do it in writing, I said. Charter amendments, decision matrices. No way to slide around a rule because a title feels tall that day. Already started drafting with Ruth, he said. I knew you'd ask. Good, I said. Then you know what I'm going to say next. He smiled like a student anticipating the question on the test. Boundaries, he said. 4 days in Boston, 3 in Rockport. Satellite office near the harbor with a secure line and a thermostat that doesn't fight you. No work after 6. No calls on Sunday unless someone bleeds data. You're getting good at this, I said. I have an unforgiving teacher, he said, and then softer, and a forgiving mother. We set the announcement for a Friday 2 weeks later. Not the kind of spectacle the harbor light had tried to be. No LED walls, no string quartet masquerading as confidence. We invited employees, board, a handful of clients who'd ridden through the storm with us, and a few press names who didn't mistake adjectives for truth. Rachel came with a notebook and a camera guy who looked like he'd been born on a sidewalk. Marco sent a tray of cannoli that somehow made it past security. I pretended not to know how. Before we went on, I stood in the wings and watched Mason read his notes like a man who finally understood that notes are only useful if you're willing to put them down. He did. He stepped to the lectern and didn't test the mic. He tested himself. We started this company in a room where the heat clicked and the paint flaked, he said. We took a shortcut to a ballroom and paid for it in public. No one moved. We're going back to the room with the bad paint and the good rules, and we're bringing all of you with us. He said my name without reaching for me. I walked out without reaching for him. That felt important. Security isn't a feature, I told the room. It's the floor. We forgot that long enough for the ground to give way. We remember now. The locks we built don't care about titles. The rules we wrote don't ask how photogenic you are. If you want speed, build it on something that can bear weight. We signed the charter changes on stage because I wanted ink where everyone could see it. Ruth, efficient as always, had tabbed the pages like a librarian with a grudge. I initialed margins that would outlive me. Mason did the same. Cameras clicked the way rain does when you're under an awning, present but not pressing in. After, people drifted to the atrium for coffee and cannoli and those careful conversations you have when the crisis has ended. But your body hasn't gotten the memo. Daniel stood with his team in a loose half-ring. Posture eased. Lila laughed with someone from legal in a way that made me want to hire 3 more Lilas and build a small church around them. Priya leaned against a pillar like she'd found a moment where leaning didn't feel like admitting anything. Gabe shook my hand like a man who doesn't do hugs but would have considered it if I'd asked. Rachel came over with the notebook closed. You changed less than you promised and more than I expected, she said, which in her dialect is praise. Write it exactly like that, I said. I will, she said. She hesitated, then added, for what it's worth, the line about pulling the plug on a beautiful demo is going to be quoted in rooms you'll never be in. Good, I said. Tell them to send cannoli. By Monday, Omar had accepted our offer. He walked through the door with a backpack instead of a briefcase and asked where the fire extinguishers were, before he asked where his desk was. I liked him more in that moment than in the entire interview process. I spent a week giving him everything he would need to make me unnecessary. He spent a week proving he didn't want to be anyone's mascot. When he asked to keep empathy in the runbook, I told him to make it a metric. We cut Julian's access without a ceremony and with a severance package that would keep us out of court and out of the headlines. There was no satisfaction in it, just the sound of a door closing politely. Victoria and her father became paragraphs in other people's stories, then footnotes, then links you forget to click. Culture has a half-life. So does noise. The satellite office in Rockport found a space above a bait shop with stairs that complained and windows that remembered the ocean better than people. We wired it the way you wire a heart after surgery, carefully, redundantly, with respect for the system it feeds. I stapled a piece of printer paper to the wall that said "No work after 6" in black marker. Mason rolled his eyes and then obeyed it with the devotion of a convert. On the first Sunday, we left the door unlocked because we were still learning how to trust our own rules. The wind found its way through a seam and made the blinds clack like a metronome. Mason fell asleep in the chair by the window with a paperback on his chest. Something about a man in Montana who built fences as a way to understand himself. I took a picture and sent it to no one. Some things you keep. That night, as the harbor lights blinked like small, patient machines, my phone vibrated on the table. A text from Priya. Audit wrap. Clean. Regulator. Cooperative. Boston Memorial. Satisfied, staying. I typed good and put the phone face down. Beside it sat a scratched bowl full of shells I've picked up on mornings when I needed to remember that foundations are slow things and that water can erase a footprint if you give it time. I stood, closed the laptop, 6 on the dot, and turned off the single lamp. Outside, the street smelled like salt and old rope. Inside, the room smelled like coffee and paper, and the kind of tired that doesn't hurt. I locked the door behind me because boundaries are only beautiful when you honor them, and I walked home along a road that once was just a way out and had become, somehow, a way back. The following Friday, Gabe forwarded a note with no body text, just a signature line from a client who had threatened to pull their data the night of the breach. "We're staying, not because you told us you're safe, because you showed us who you are when you weren't." I read it in the morning light, with waves shouldering the rocks and gulls insulting each other on the pier, and I let myself sit for a minute before the day began. You can save a company with code and rules and an announcement. You rebuild it with breakfasts, with small answers to questions no one hears you ask, with the everyday choice not to be impressive, but to be right. On Saturday, I made pancakes that didn't stick and coffee that did. Mason knocked out of habit and walked in without waiting, which is how you know habit is becoming trust again. He set a bottle of syrup on the counter, caught my look, and swapped it for berries, like a man who understands conditionals finally run both ways. We ate at the little table that has learned more about us than any boardroom ever will. He told me about a feature he wanted to pitch to Omar and why he wouldn't until the runbook said it was ready. I told him about a grant I'd been asked to consult on for a community hospital that still uses paper in places paper doesn't belong. We didn't talk about ballrooms or LED walls or fathers with opinions and money. We talked about work that pays in something other than applause. When he left, he hugged me in the doorway and didn't say thank you, because the thank you had become the act of showing up at 10 with the right bottle and the right eyes. After the taillights disappeared, I washed dishes slowly, the way you do when you want hot water to have a chance at fixing what cold can't. Then I picked up my pen and opened a blank page in a notebook that doesn't live on any network. At the top I wrote "Playbook, Final Draft." Under it, a line I wish someone had written for me 10 years ago. When the beautiful demo asks you to cut a corner, close the laptop, step outside, and go listen to the ocean. If the sound you hear is relief, you are about to be wrong. I underlined it once, not twice. Then I put the pen away and went outside, where the wind made a sound like rooms forgetting the wrong story and remembering the right one. The first real test of peace didn't arrive like a siren. It came as an email with an attachment and a subject line that sounded like opportunity. RFP, Federal Health Consortium Pilot, Aegis Vault. The kind of contract that buys you years of runway and a seat at the grown-up table. Priya printed it out because she knows I think with a pen in my hand. I read it at the satellite office above the bait shop, the ocean filing its soft brief under ours. The scope was sane, the timeline not insane, and the clause halfway down page 4 that made my jaw harden. Live demonstration to include simulated patient data that appears indistinguishable from production. I closed my eyes and heard glass break at the harbor light all over again. I heard the intake of a room when they recognized themselves in a failure. I brought the pen down once on the clause and wrote no in the margin, then Y, and an arrow to a note about staged data and lines you never cross. I called Mason because I wanted his voice in the room where mine had just sharpened. He arrived 16 minutes later, wind in his hair and coffee in hand, and read the same clause like a man who is not about to blink. "We're not doing that," he said, and I loved the part of him that didn't have to consult my face to know it. "Then we'll lose it," I said. "Someone else will fake production and win the day and spend the next month explaining the difference between indistinguishable and unsafe while their lawyers warm their hands by the fire." "Then we lose it," he said, with a tone you only get once you've decided what you are and are not for sale for. He poured his coffee into an office mug with a chipped lip because the mug knows stories he needs to remember. "Or," he added, "we win it by moving the line, not crossing it." "How?" "We write the demo so it's not a demo," he said, the old engineering spark returning to his eyes. "We build a sealed habitat, a sandbox we can prove is hermetic, with data that looks, performs, and breaks like reality. We let their team throw hammers at it. We put the kill switch on stage, in my hand, in your hand, in theirs. We make safety the trick." I stared at him, hoping the feeling in my chest wasn't pride pretending to be oxygen. "You'll get pushback," I said. "I know," he said. "I'm not shopping for approval." We sent a response that might as well have been a manifesto in PDF clothing. Priya wrote the cover letter with language measured like medicine. I diagrammed the habitat like a patent. Omar added the kill switch logic like a prayer. We hit send and went for a walk along the harbor because sometimes the only antidote to waiting is wind. They asked for a meeting, not a ballroom. A government building with carpet nobody loves and ceilings designed to make a person of any height feel regular. Their panel was a collection of the exact humans who make the world turn without applause. A nurse who'd learned data because patience. A systems architect with ink stains on his fingers. A procurement lead who'd memorized more acronyms than a person should. The procurement lead read our clause about the kill switch twice and looked up. "You're going to put the off button on stage?" "Yes," I said, "and we're going to push it." "You'll tank your own demo," the nurse said, but she sounded more curious than skeptical. "We'll show you where the cliff is and the guardrails that keep you from pretending it isn't," Mason said. "If a vendor isn't willing to fail in front of you on purpose, you should assume you'll help them do it by accident." The architect smiled without showing teeth. "When can you do it?" "Give us 3 weeks," I said. "We'll bring the habitat. Your team will wire the hammers. No smoke, no mirrors, no lawyers until after." Back in Boston, we turned the Soxy into a laboratory and the bait shop office into a chapel. Omar built the walls of the habitat, like a man who had lived in too many rooms with doors that locked from the outside. Daniel wrote chaos where code would learn to love order. Lila rehearsed comms with the patience of someone who can say the same sentence 6 ways and still mean it. I walked the room with a notebook and wrote down the assumptions that have gotten better companies than ours in trouble. Mason hung a handwritten sign over the door to the lab. "If you are here to impress, you are in the wrong room." On the 3rd Friday, we wheeled our little world into a government auditorium that smelled like politics and floor wax. The panel sat straight-backed and ready. Rachel was there because of course she was. The camera guy looked like he'd slept in the van. Mason stood center stage. I took stage left with a headset, not because I needed it, but because ritual matters and competence lives in optics too. Omar, Daniel, and Priya were off stage with their hands on nothing and everything. Mason began with a sentence that earned us the right to talk. "We are not here to show you a perfect day. We're here to show you the day you'll get." He walked them through the habitat, what it contained, what it didn't, how it moved, how it stopped. I pulled up logs on the big screen because I wanted them to see that even our graphs had a heartbeat. The nurse asked for a failure scenario she'd seen in an ICU with a system built by a vendor with a better booth. Omar nodded, ran the script, and let the room hear the soft thump of the guardrail holding. The architect asked for something uglier. We obliged. The procurement lead asked for the thing no one ever asks for. Push the button. Mason looked to me, I looked to him. We both looked to the panel. "You sure?" he asked, and the procurement lead's mouth twitched, which is bureaucrat for God. "Yes." I pushed it. The habitat stopped the way a heart monitor quiets after a nurse adjusts a lead. Decisive, not dramatic. We displayed the logs. Last event, last write, last token. We displayed the path back. Checks, verifications, the triple signature that had cost us pride and bought us sleep. We turned it all on again. We waited the 3 seconds that feel like a year. The system purred. The nurse put her pen down. "I've never had a vendor show me the off switch," she said. "You'd be amazed how many tell me there isn't one." "I wouldn't," I said. "I've read their code." They didn't hug us. They didn't clap. They asked for 3 references and a draft of the MOU with the clauses we'd proposed about audit, disclosure, and the right to pull the plug again without notice. We sent the documents before we packed the van. On the drive back, Mason watched the ocean out his window and didn't talk, which is how I knew he had learned something you can't narrate. We won the pilot a week later, not with a headline, with a phone call that began with the procurement lead clearing his throat and ended with Priya doing math silently in the air. We told no one outside the few who needed to know, because the lesson of the LED wall is that applause simmers better when it's earned on a stove that isn't on stage. Inside Northbridge, the win landed like permission to believe we were who we said we were. That night, back at the bait shop office, I took down the no work after 6 sign because the sun still had work to do, and I wanted to watch it. Mason arrived without knocking. He flopped into the chair by the window and let his feet find the rung like it was a lesson from childhood he'd finally remembered. He looked at the harbor until the boats turned to sketches and said, "I kept waiting for the part where we had to be clever to be good." "We were clever," I said. "We were honest first." He nodded. "I'm starting to like honest more." Sundays settled into themselves the way a song finds its chorus. Blueberries, batter, an argument about how dark pancakes should be, a truce at medium gold. We talked about the pilot like it was a thing that could break if we spoke too loud near it. We talked about Omar's plan for the first 90 days, and how his empathy metric was making engineers mad in exactly the way that precedes a culture change. We talked about nothing at all, which turned out to be a luxury I had forgotten you had to schedule. In the 3rd month, the board convened for the review the charter demanded. The numbers were boring, which is the only way numbers should be at a meeting like that. Uptime without flair, incident counts without spikes, client retention without heroic caveats. Ruth's pen hovered, then landed. "Recommendation," she said. "We make co-leadership permanent. Mason as CEO, Nora as CTO with authority over security. Charter amendments as drafted. Satellite office rules enshrined as lore and policy." She looked at me. "Anything to add?" "Just that lore without policy is nostalgia," I said, "and policy without lore is brittle. We should remember both." Gabe grunted, which is his way of applauding. Paul said something about markets I translated to "nice job." The vote was unanimous. We didn't take a picture. We didn't need to. We announced it the next day in the atrium without ceremony. Mason spoke about floors and guardrails. I spoke about doors and locks and how to leave them open for the right people and closed for the others. Someone started a slow clap and someone else killed it, and I loved them both for different reasons. After, in the corridor, Mason stopped like a man who had heard a word on a frequency other people can't detect. "I don't say this because of titles," he said. "I say it because our lives are bigger than this building. I'm glad you stayed." "I didn't," I said, and watched confusion flicker across his face until I finished. "I came and went, that's the point." He smiled the way you smile when a sentence lands in your ribs. "Right," he said. "Right." At home, I put the kettle on and watched steam find the only path it could. The ocean knocked the shore with the confidence of a thing that has learned its own edges. I wrote the last entry in the playbook I keep in the notebook that isn't on any network. When they ask for a trick, show them the truth. When they ask for speed, show them the floor. When they ask for you, bring someone who can replace you and teach them when to leave. I closed the book and set it under a seashell that held a whole beach in its curve. Later, Mason texted a photo of a sign he'd hung above the sock door. "We win with the off switch." I sent back a picture of a skillet with batter in it and the caption, "Medium gold or exile." He replied with a laughing face and then, "On my way." I turned the flame down, opened the window to let the salt in, and thought about every door I'd closed in the last months, and every one I'd opened. In the end, this is what endurance looks like when you stop trying to make it pretty. A chair by a window, a company with rules, a son who knows where the kill switch is and isn't afraid to use it. The ocean kept its time. The stove ticked. When tires crunched the shells in my drive, I didn't check the clock. I flipped the pancake at exactly the right second and let the rest of the story arrive without needing to be announced. Spring kept its promise and then over-delivered. By May, the atrium plants at North Bridge looked less like props and more like inhabitants, and the security monitors glowed with the kind of steady green you don't Instagram because it looks like nothing. Until you remember how much work it takes to make nothing happen. The Federal Health Consortium pilot moved from trial to routine with the grace of a system that knows what it's for. Their nurse sent Omar a selfie with a sticky note on her monitor that read, "Off switch equals trust," and he taped a copy beside the sock door like a benediction. We didn't talk about reputation recovery anymore. We talked about release notes and office coffee and which team owed pizza because their unit tests saved us an hour. It turns out normal is a revolution when you haven't had it. On a Tuesday that smelled like rain and printer toner, Ruth slid a draft invitation across my desk. A public university wanted me to keynote a small security symposium. No stage fog, no headline fee, just a room of students and early career engineers who were sick of slides about velocity. I said yes, because I remembered being 22 and figuring out the difference between clever and good. The talk wrote itself in the margins of my week. The LED wall we won't mention by name, the habitat and its deliberate silence. The first time I said no to a clause that would have paid well and cost more. On the day, I stood at a lectern that wobbled and told 100 faces, if a feature only works when no one is looking, it isn't a feature. If a demo requires a corner to be cut, you've mapped a cliff. Build railings, not illusions. When I finished, a kid in a thrift store blazer asked the question I used to ask myself in quieter rooms. How do you convince leadership? I said, you don't. You build systems that make the right thing easy and the wrong thing visible. He nodded like I'd handed him a tool and not just a sentence. We got our first proper scare since the pilot win on a Friday afternoon, because of course we did. A vendor we liked updated a library we used, and the new version tried too hard at exactly the wrong time. In the old days, that would have meant a Slack avalanche and a prayer. This time, an analyst named June saw the pattern at 4:11, flagged it by 4:12, and hit a button that darkened the affected path at 4:13. No drama. Just a 3-minute blip, a 5-minute fix, and a 15-minute debrief, where June explained what she saw and why she chose the path that saved us the headline. We clapped after she left the room, not before, because you don't make a hero out of muscle memory, you make it into policy. Mason came by the bait shop office more often and stayed longer. Some afternoons he'd read in the chair by the window, boots hooked on the rung, waves ticking the glass like a metronome. Other days we'd argue architecture with the gentleness of two people who know they're on the same side, even when they take different exits. He is still learning that quiet is not surrender. I am still learning that quiet is sometimes better than a plan. On one of those afternoons, he looked up from a marked-up runbook and said, almost to himself, I don't miss the rooms. I said, rooms are better when they have doors. And he smiled like the line fit somewhere he could use it. The day Whitmore Capital became indictments instead of whispers, Priya only raised an eyebrow as she dropped a printout on my desk. No triumph, just the neatness of cause and effect accounting for itself. I texted Mason one word, learned, and he wrote back kept. We didn't mention names. The lesson had outgrown them. We tried something new with the team, a monthly show the off switch hour where any group could bring a piece of the system and kill it in friendly company. No shame, no scoring, just practice. Sales came once, red-faced and game, and cut power on a sandbox, while Priya narrated like a sportscaster explaining why the boring play is sometimes the winning play. Lila brought a script that generated the emails we never want to send and read one aloud just to hear how the verbs felt in a human mouth. Daniel grinned the entire time, which is how you measure progress in an engineer without asking. On Sundays, pancakes remained medium gold by treaty. Mason learned to mix until just shy of smooth and to wait for the second bubble to hold before flipping. A metaphor so on the nose we stopped acknowledging it. He still knocks sometimes, but not always, which is how trust becomes weather. We've collected a small ritual of silences. The one where we drink coffee and watch a gull pretend to be dignified. The one where I hand him a page from my notebook and he hands it back without comment. The one where he says I was wrong about, and I say, I was, too. And we let the sentence end there because the admission is the point. By June, the satellite office had its own rhythm. The bait shop below installed a bell that dings when someone buys squid, and it became our 6 p.m. curfew. When the bell rings, we close laptops. Twice we missed it. Twice we made up for it with a morning walk to the pier where the rules enforce themselves. Omar framed our 3 lines and hung them by the door. Tell the truth. Use the off switch. Go home. Simple borders make hard days navigable. One evening, as fog pulled itself across the harbor like a careful blanket, I stood at the window and thought about the life we'd built beyond fixing what we broke. The company was steady, not because we were brilliant, but because we were done pretending brilliance could substitute for backbone. The relationship was steady, not because we'd solved each other, but because we'd stopped auditioning. I wrote one more line at the bottom of the playbook and closed it with the kind of satisfaction that doesn't need witnesses. Reliability is love, just spelled in work. A car rolled over the shells in my drive right on cue. I didn't check the clock. I flipped the pancake at the second bubble and let the door stay unlocked, the way you do when your house has learned the habit of welcome and your company finally knows what its foundation is for. July arrived soft and salt bright, the kind of Boston summer that forgives. Northbridge felt like a well-tuned engine, no heroics, just torque. One Thursday near dusk, the bell from the bait shop dinged, and I was already closing my laptop when June, our analyst with the quick eye, pinged Omar. A vendor cert about to expire on a low-traffic endpoint Sunday at 2 a.m. Old Northbridge would have shrugged and rolled the dice. New Northbridge didn't gamble with clocks. Omar pulled a skeleton crew, drafted the rotation plan, and, without asking, scheduled it from the satellite office so the off switch lived where our rules live. I told him I wouldn't come. He nodded like that was the test. At 1:58 a.m., I woke anyway because mothers do. I didn't open the laptop. I poured water, watched fog comb the harbor, and stood still while someone else carried the weight. At 2:14, my phone buzzed once. Done. Green. Go back to sleep. I did. On Monday, we hosted Show the Off Switch with an audience we'd never had. 3 interns. Bright in the way that makes you careful. Daniel killed a service, Priya narrated, Lila read the what-if email, Mason stood in the back with his arms uncrossed, learning how to lead by letting the room be smart without him. After, one intern asked me how you know you can trust a system. You don't, I said. You build it so distrust is cheap. That night, Bellinis smelled like tomatoes and victory no one needed to post. Marco seated us under the crooked frame of Rachel's article. Mason lifted his glass. To boring green, he said. I added, to rules that love us back, and we drank to both. Back at the house, the ocean took its breath and gave it back. I opened my notebook, wrote a single line, and underlined it once. Let the guardrails hold so your hands can rest. Tires crushed shells in the drive. The door stayed unlocked. Medium gold arrived on the second bubble. We didn't say much. We didn't have to. The foundation was doing the talking. August leaned in with heat and a sky the color of aluminum. The bait shop bell stuck once and we laughed, called it an omen, then watched the harbor turn slate as a storm shouldered its way inland. At 4:37 p.m. the lights in the satellite office flickered, the kind of shiver that used to turn us feral. Omar was already at the panel, not dramatic, just ready. The UPS took the first punch. The generator caught the second. Our Habitat demo rack purred like it trusted us back. We didn't celebrate. Daniel logged the failover time to the millisecond. June timestamped the alerts and wrote 3 lines in the post-incident doc that read like a good haiku. Power dipped, rails held, nothing spilled. Mason watched the rain sheet the window and said, almost to himself, I used to think leadership was a room, now I think it's a routine. I said, rooms leak, routines carry buckets. He smiled like that, lived somewhere useful. That weekend, we drove inland to the community hospital that still kept charts in manila folders. No press, no pitch. Just wiring a small clinic's intake to a safer path and teaching a nurse to trust a button she could press without asking permission. Lila rewrote their breach letter into a policy they might never need. Priya negotiated a service clause that protected them from vendors like the one I used to be angry at. We left before anyone could say thank you because this work doesn't bill in gratitude. Back in Rockport, the air cooled. The gulls argued over nothing worth winning. I opened the notebook and wrote, "When the storm tests the lights, let the quiet prove the design." Tires found the shells, the door stayed open, and Mason walked in carrying blueberries and a paperback. Medium gold hit on the second bubble. We ate standing up, watching the last rain stitch the harbor back together. The off switch exactly where it belonged, visible, reachable, ordinary. The independent audit closed on a rain-glossed Thursday morning with one word, clean. No footnotes, no hedged caveats, just a stamp tidy enough for the whole floor to exhale at once. Ruth forwarded the email with exactly 2 words, as promised, and Gabe replied with a gin-dry thumbs up. By afternoon, the board convened for 20 efficient minutes. Omar was appointed permanent CSO, no interim, no asterisks. When he signed, he looked at me like a man receiving a toolkit, not a crown. "I'll keep the kill switch where anyone can reach it," he said. "And I'll turn empathy into a metric people complain about, then rely on." I nodded, slid the interim tag off my badge, and tucked it into a drawer like a key that had done its job. We marked the moment the only way Northbridge knows how, a brown bag session titled How to Fail on Purpose, Release Edition. Daniel re-demoed the habitat for the whole company. Lila read aloud the ugly but true customer email template we hope we'll never need. The room laughed, not to diffuse fear, but because it felt strong enough to name it. Priya published Playbook V1.0 to the public. 3 lines on page 1. Tell the truth. Use the off switch. Go home. We open-sourced a slice of our tooling. Omar wrote a readme that read like a vow. The atrium screens glowed steady green. No confetti, no speeches. Mason stood at the edge, hands in his pockets, letting the team speak for him. As people drifted out, he leaned toward me. "We finally built the thing that keeps us from needing heroes." "Good," I said. "Let the process be the hero, and let's leave for Rockport at 6. Downstairs, the bait shop bell gave its small, merciful chime. We actually closed our laptops. In the garage, I opened my notebook and wrote 1 line. "The best day after a crisis is the day with nothing to tell, just rules beating like a heart." The Federal Health Consortium didn't send a press release. They sent a purchase order the length of a novella and a note from procurement that read, "Pilot Program." It was the kind of upgrade that turns CFOs into poets. Priya did the math in the air and smiled without showing teeth. Within an hour, sales arrived with their usual weather front, a rush calendar, a discount for live demo clause, and a slide labeled "Stretch Goal equals Hero Moment." Old us might have reached for capes. New us didn't cosplay. "We're not trading safety for spectacle," I said, pushing the clause back. "Stage it. Habitat rules, kill switch on stage, in our hands and theirs. If that loses us a logo, it's a logo we couldn't afford." Mason backed it without blinking. We didn't crawl out of a ballroom to sprint back in. We built a rollout that was boring by design. Phased regions, canary tenants, published playbooks, pre-agreed pause criteria. Omar drew the guardrails in thick ink. Daniel wired alarms you could hear in your bones. Lila wrote the comms that would make a pause sound like competence, not fear. When a regional exec tried to slip a silent bypass into a revised SOW, Ruth sent back a red line that might as well have been a sermon. Gabe forwarded it to the board with 1 word, spine. Between Boston and Rockport, the rhythm held. 4 days in the tower, 3 above the bait shop. At 6, the bell downstairs dinged and laptops closed, even on deal days. Twice I almost cheated. Twice Mason pointed at the hand-lettered sign, "Tell the truth. Use the off switch. Go home." "You wrote it," he said. "We live it." The first wave went live on a Tuesday that smelled like rain and printer toner. Nothing dramatic happened. We counted that as victory. That night, Bellini's tasted like relief. Back in Rockport, I wrote 1 line in the playbook. When money asks for a hero, give it a schedule and a kill switch. Tires crushed shells in the drive right on time. Medium gold landed on the second bubble. Balance, not as myth, just a practice we kept. The last test came so small we almost missed it. A Friday, 5:42 p.m., The bell downstairs mid-ding when June flagged a strange drift on a low-traffic endpoint. Not a breach, not even a headline. Just a permission gone sideways the way screws loosen in old houses. Old Northbridge would have spun up a war room and wrecked a weekend. New Northbridge followed the book. June hit pause. Omar blessed the rollback. Daniel traced the change to a library update and fixed it with the grace of someone who didn't need to be seen. Lila sent the ugly but true note to the 2 customers who could have felt it. We paused to protect you. Here's what happened. Here's what we changed. Replies came back in minutes. Thanks for telling us first. No drama. No cape. Just systems working like conscience. I closed my laptop at 6 on the dot. In the atrium, the screen glowed that quiet green we'd bled for. On the sock door, our hand-lettered laws, tell the truth, use the off switch, go home. Looked less like rules and more like a life. Mason walked beside me without a speech. In the garage, he said, I used to think leadership was how loud you could be in a storm. I said, it's how calm you can be when the rain is ordinary. He smiled. We drove north. Rockport smelled like salt and second chances. I opened the window. The ocean kept time. In my notebook, the playbook got one final line. Be reliable. Let time do the clapping. Tires crushed shells in the drive right on cue. The door stayed unlocked. Medium gold landed on the second bubble. We ate standing up, watching the harbor stitch itself back together. Off switch visible. Guardrails holding. A company steady not because we were heroes, but because we'd learned the courage of the unremarkable. And for once that was the whole story.